Hello and welcome to the Huddersfield Literature Festival. My name's Michelle Hodgson and I'm the Festival Director. We're here today to talk about David Baker's new book, A Brief History of the Last 13.8 Billion Years. And as you can imagine, it's an incredibly interesting book with lots of fascinating facts throughout. We're going to try and give a little bit of an overview of those 13.8 billion years today. So welcome to the festival, David.
Glad to be here.
So could I ask you, well, I'll just give a little bit of background first. David is a history and science writer for simonwhistler.com. He holds the world's first PhD in big history, having studied under the historian David Christian. He's delivered award-winning university lectures, and he's a visiting lecturer at the Sorbonne in Paris. And he also wrote the YouTube series Crash Course Big History in partnership with Gates Big History Project. Is there anything you'd like to add to that biography?
That sounds like a pretty good resume, yes.
Okay, well, let's start at the very beginning. How did the Big Bang grow from a tiny white speck?
Right, okay. How did it? Not why, but how, just so I get the grammar of your question. How? Okay. Well, current theory in Big Bang cosmology goes that you start at an infinitesimal space, singularity where all space, time, energy is contained, everything that exists in the universe now. And then at about 10 to the power of negative 36 seconds until about 10 to the power of negative 32 seconds, which is 0.0000000, a very small splinter of a second, you saw a rapid acceleration of the universe in what's known as cosmic inflation from something much smaller than an atom, or even a quark in an atom, to something about the size of a grapefruit. Though some estimates vary. I've heard some say it's more like a beach ball, but it gives you an idea. But in a very small fragment of a second. But that is a tremendous amount of growth to happen in that space of time. Because if you were to do that same rate of acceleration again, you would inflate that grapefruit or that basketball or beach ball to the current size of the universe in the same space of time, just to give you an idea of scale. So if you were to run that entire cosmic inflationary period again, it would just be 93 billion light years across. And during that same period of inflation, pretty much all the laws that we know of in this universe, the way it functions, the balance between the fundamental forces of gravity, electromagnetism, and the strong and weak nuclear forces, all of it came into being. More than that, the distribution of energy in hot spots and cold spots across the universe also came into being at that time, which created all of the stars and galaxies and hot spots, which in turn went on to create planets and chemicals and organic life. So a lot was written in that time, and it's just been playing out ever since. That's how the Big Bang happened.
That's quite something. How can our human brains contemplate what was there before the universe? You explained that our brains aren't quite hardwired for that in the book. It's like, I think you said it's like trying to send a text using a toaster, which I thought was a great analogy. And that we end up with an existential headache. Is that just because of the way we've evolved as humans to try and think of things outside the known universe and also imagine how it came about is just too much for our tiny brains.
Well, it's so far removed from what's necessary for evolutionary survival for humans. Humans are lucky in the sense that through a quirk of evolution, we're able to understand and communicate a heck of a lot more than it would be necessary for a primate to survive. But generally speaking, evolution gives you what you need to exist. And we could have existed on a heck of a lot less. A diminished intellectual capacity of, say, some of our earlier primate ancestors or some of our cousins, though arguably we might have gone extinct. As it is, we're highly successful and we spread across the face of the earth. But even then, what was required for survival for 300,000 years, the Paleolithic, and the previous 3 million years from when we started walking on 2 feet bipedal, um, uh, what's required is right here in front of us on Earth. What goes up must come down. Be scared of snakes and spiders because they might be poisonous. Be scared of big predators with sharp, pointy teeth. Um, that that is our entire realm of conception. And so the further you go beyond the Earth, our brains and our powers of observation being highly terrestrial. Once you move beyond the Earth, not just to the vastness of space and the incomprehensible number of galaxies, but to something at the start of the cosmos that defies space and time and physics, because time had just begun to exist. Um, and space was all expanding. And at the period of cosmic inflation, or quote unquote, before the Big Bang, the physics of our universe hadn't even become coherent yet, which is why when you want to look at prior to cosmic inflation, to the smallest increments of time that that exist that are comprehensible to scientists, you have to unlearn a lot of what you know about physics, and then you get into some very strange theory that sounds like gibberish and actually may be gibberish because the theory might be completely wrong. So, yeah, we're not evolved to contemplate that thing. That's 3 billion years removed from our own intellectual capacity, which is, I suppose, why it's all the more impressive that thanks to mathematics and tireless research and observation, we're able to piece some of these things together, and we're getting better at it all the time. Who knows? In 200 years, we might have figured out the whole thing.
Mm. Let's talk about black holes. There have been lots of different theories about what they are, what they can do. They're obviously very popular in science fiction, movies and books, with the idea that time travel might be possible, traveling through galaxies might be possible. What do you think? I'm going to put you on the spot. What do you think is the most plausible explanation for what they are?
My personal opinion is black holes are overrated. Um, on the surface, on the surface, all they are is a huge, huge lump of matter. That's to say, you've got stars which are already, it's so much matter clumped together with a star that it sets off a perpetual nuclear explosion. Well, ratchet that up to so much matter being in one spot in the universe that it creates a black hole. It sucks everything in on itself. That is fascinating. But it is just a giant lump. This is just surface level, right? It also gives off radiation. The black holes will eventually decay and evaporate many trillions upon trillions and trillions of years from now, just like all the other matter in the universe. But where people in science fiction get excited is if you've got all that mass in one area, you're going to bend space time. And so who knows, maybe you could travel down a black hole and reach other dimensions or other parts of the universe or other areas of time, travel forward or backward. Um, that presupposes a lot. And and when you're talking about just a massive pile of stuff in one place, if you were to dive into a big pile of garbage at the dump, you're not time traveling. You're just getting covered in garbage. And if there's enough garbage, you're going to be smothered to death. It's the same principle basically with getting sucked into a black hole. You will be spaghettified and torn to shreds. No technology, I don't think, could possibly ever exist, no matter how godlike a civilization that devises it, to be able to transform a black hole into something useful like a portal. But that's my personal opinion.
Okay. It's estimated that 300 million planets in the Milky Way may be capable of sustaining life. Do you think they're just too far away for us to have encountered this yet?
Well, the Milky Way is 100,000 light years in diameter. So you're going to be hard pressed to see the signs of any sort of life. When you figure that in all statistical probability that life is going to be single cell. It was really just a fluke of nature that we had the evolution of multi-celled life on Earth. But let's say that fluke happens somewhere in 300 million again, a few times. You're still not going to see the signs of multi-celled life on the surface of a planet from many, many light years away, which leaves intelligent life. And once you drill down to the odds of intelligent life capable of communicating or at least giving signals out into the rest of the universe like we do, statistically, it becomes less probable that there is something like that living concurrently with us in the Milky Way. And that's to say within a range of 100,000 years, because of course, light takes time to travel, as with the signals that they would send out. But once you start multiplying out into other galaxies in the universe, then it's almost a certainty that is other intelligent life out there somewhere. But as for why we haven't encountered any life yet, well, that is not surprising. However, depending on your take, there's some theorists who would go as far as to say, astrobiologists who would go as far to say that life is very likely and probable in the universe, so much so that they would say it's highly likely that there is single-celled life somewhere else in our solar system, which would be a heck of a thing to find. Doesn't seem like it's going to be on Mars. We've tapped that well pretty much, but perhaps one of the moons of Jupiter or Saturn.
Well, we look forward to more discoveries and voyages to potentially find out more about this life. So the Earth was born around 4.5 billion years ago, and the first life appeared around 3.8 billion years ago. So why did it take so long for life to appear?
Because for the first several 100 million years on Earth, the planet was still cooling, and it was the Hadean epoch, which Hades, hell, that was basically what it was, hell on Earth. The crust of the Earth was paper thin and constantly being pelted by asteroids, as the rest of the planets in the solar system accreted together, sucked up all that extra debris that had formed from the dust of the early solar system. And what that meant was unbreathable atmosphere, extremely high temperatures, oceans of lava. After the moon was formed from an intense collision with a protoplanet, that moon was a lot closer to Earth than it is today. It's been slowly drifting off. And the gravitational force of that moon would have pulled tidal waves across the surface of the Earth. Of course, there was no liquid water. There were no oceans at the time, which would mean gigantic tidal waves of lava. And then you'd have jets of steam, volcanoes constantly erupting, super volcanic eruptions, that the type of which that if they happened on Earth today, it would probably wipe out 70% of all species on Earth, including us. So a process like abiogenesis, which is extremely fragile and extremely dependent on a specific set of circumstances, could not have possibly occurred in Hadean epoch.
So talking about the first signs of life and DNA, you say that mutations create historical change in biology. And I just wondered if you could explain that in a bit more detail.
Well, that's pretty much pointing toward the fundamental nature of evolution. If you didn't have mutations in the replication of DNA being driven by a consequence of just a chemical reaction to copy itself. If you didn't have copying errors, every billion copies or so, you would have no change, and we would still be the same single-celled microscopic species living on the edge of underwater volcanoes in the ocean. In fact, it's possible we'd be extinct, but those extremophiles are still there, and they're very closely related in terms of our DNA to our universal last common ancestor. So yeah, if you don't have any sort of evolutionary change in species, you're not going to have a history. You're not going to have a sequence of events. You're just going to have status quo for as long as life on Earth exists.
Jumping ahead to the Carboniferous era, 358 to 298 million years ago. I loved your description of this. You say it would be an excellent setting for a time travel horror film. I know you're currently in Australia, so you're used to kind of various large and dangerous insects and other creatures, but I wondered if you could explain why this would be such a good place for a time travel horror film.
The cliche about Australia and everything trying to kill you is hugely exaggerated, just as a sidebar. But yeah, it's the Carboniferous was a period of immense forest cover on the Earth and gigantic trees the size of skyscrapers. And that increased the oxygen in the atmosphere to in the range of 30-35%. It's about 20%, 21% on Earth today. And what the increased oxygen does is it increases the metabolism of insects and arachnids. And that means they can grow larger. It's atmospherically, it's pretty difficult for an insect or an arachnid to get big these days, regardless of its genetics. But if it's got more oxygen to burn, it's very easy for them to evolve. So that's why you wind up with scorpions that are 7 feet long, dragonflies that are the size of eagles. It's would have been quite the terrifying environment to live in when you figure how squeamish humans are about bugs. The same goes with giant spiders and centipedes and all the rest. And terrestrial arthropods, insects and arachnids, they were the sort of predominant species on the surface of the Earth at the time. Our direct ancestors at the time were tiny little amphibians trying desperately to stay out of the way, slowly evolving into reptiles.
So jumping forward to our evolution, or rather the evolution of primates 55 million years ago, and then our ancestors, the great apes of Africa, around 25 to 30 million years ago. Can you describe 2 or 3 traits that we've inherited, or rather retained from them?
From which group?
From the great apes.
From the great apes. Oh God, we have an unbelievable amount in common with the great apes. Probably one of the most significant is the highly sociable nature of most great ape species. The exception would be gibbons, but they're known as sort of like a lesser great apes. Mildly insulting bit of taxonomy, but they tend to pair up with mates, and keep to themselves for very specific biological reasons. But the rest of the great apes, chimpanzees, gorillas, bonobos, highly social. And the thing about all that socialization is it creates dynamics, and in the case of other primates, hierarchies where there's a politics to deal with, dealing with the business of access to food and access to mates. And all of that socialization requires a great deal of brain power to process. So that that group nature of the great apes actually contributed a lot to the evolution of our own abilities and our own cognition. Um, that would be similarity to the ability to vocalize. Even chimpanzees have a range of I think about 30 or 40 vocalizations with specific meanings. It's not quite spoken speech, and their larynx is too high to create a wide range of words. But language, of course, is very important, and chimpanzees are more than capable of it. They're also capable of interpreting symbols. That's to say, basic, very fundamental pictographic writing, and with human guidance, and also show with capacity for sign language in the same way. So a lot of the rudiments were already there. Let's last one, inventiveness. We all have the capacity to, as great apes, to invent things, to use tools. Now, some of this tool use is sporadic, but some of it is taught from generation to generation. So again, with chimpanzees, there's a practice in some wild chimpanzee groups for mothers to teach their young to fish for termites in termite mounds with sticks. And that is a generational invention. It's not just remarkable because chimpanzees are using tools, it's a generational thing that's taught as a skill. The only place where humans seem to differ is we also teach each other generation after generation through various means, and of course, various doctrines and ideas. But what happens with us is it accumulates, it adds up. So you could fast forward 100,000 years and chimpanzees would still be fishing for termites in West and Central Africa. Fast forward human society 100,000 years, well, the accumulation is going to be drastically different. And it's that accumulation that has taken us from stone tools to skyscrapers in the last 12,000 years since the invention of agriculture.
Moving on from that, could you tell us a bit about collective learning? What is it, and why is it important?
Well, that's the term for what I just described. Collective learning is the accumulation of more information in a species with each generation than is lost by the next. So the key word there is accumulation. So if I figure out as a hunter-gatherer 200,000 years ago in East Africa how to create a better, sharper stone hand axe, I'm going to pass on that information to my community and future generations. And unless they all die out, or we have very bad luck, or some very lazy people, and they do exist, but generally speaking, that innovation is going to be passed on. Now, what makes collective learning so remarkable is fast forward a generation or two, and maybe someone else has a great idea to improve on that very self-same design. And that sort of tinkering and improvement, and new ideas coming into the fold all the time, that is what led to the increase of human complexity, technological and otherwise, over the course of our species' existence. And that is something, that accumulation is something that makes us rather unique in nature. You don't see it in many other species, if any. You might have seen it in other hominine species that are now extinct.
Um, Remains of Homo sapiens have been found from 315,000 years ago, although it's possible they could have been around longer. We just haven't found the remains yet. And for tens of thousands of years, we were foragers living in small groups. I loved your expression that today we're cavemen in fancy shoes. I wondered if you could explain that.
Sure. Yeah, 315,000 years. That's a very conservative estimate on my part. I think it's been pushed up to about 350, but that's off of the back of some fossils that were found in Northwest Africa that were dated to about 350. But 350 sounds about fair. But if you add another 50,000 years on top of that, we're almost as old as Neanderthals. So that's quite the we would suddenly not be the younger cousin. We would sort of have evolved side by side. Anyway, we lived most of our existence, like something like 98% of our existence, in hunter-gatherer communities of a few dozen people. And prior to that, for the previous 3 million years, we were bipedal, hunting and gathering and scavenging across Africa. Um, well before we even got into the genus Homo, when we were still talking Australopithecus. That's what we were doing, and so that is a very similar lifestyle. So figure millions of years of evolution and 300,000 years of human existence. That's the community that we're living in. Those are that's the theater in which we developed all of our instincts. We are mostly attuned to survive in that environment. Hunting and gathering, not a lot of people. And the people you know quite well. So then, because of collective learning and the acceleration of technology the last 12,000 years, suddenly we're surrounded by, today, millions of people in a nation, hundreds of thousands or millions in the city. And it's an entirely different kettle of fish. And we're more sedentary, and we're not, in as good a shape as we might be because we're sat in front of computers. We're not stalking gazelle. But to give you a key example of how our instincts are better suited to Paleolithic living. Do you have fear of public speaking, or do you you ever get nervous when you're talking to a particular person, like I don't know, a boss or potential romantic partner? You get butterflies, nervousness, talking in front of crowds. People feel phobic. Even people who are used to this sort of thing, or very outgoing, extroverted, charismatic, they might have that little twinge of nervousness. And there's a very good reason why that anxiety, that shot of adrenaline exists. It's because if you were living with the same two dozen people your entire life, and you were to put yourself out on a limb and talk in front of the group authoritatively, or if you were to try to flirt with someone within that group, and you messed up in either respect, you might be humiliated, exiled, ostracized. If you did something really bad, maybe someone might bash your head in with a rock. And if you messed up in a relationship or a potential romantic relationship within that group, that person would then go on to tell their friends, and everyone suddenly who is of the right age and compatibility to you might suddenly sexually reject you, which means you're either killed or exiled, meaning you might likely be killed, or sexually rejected, in which case your genes are wiped from the gene pool. So that trigger of butterflies in the stomach or stage fright, very useful when it comes to Paleolithic living. Now it's just an annoyance, because you could, in the space of one day, try to flirt with 2 dozen people, and completely mess up each time, and it won't matter because you live in a city of, say, 2 million or 5 million people, and you will never see them again. And with public speaking, people have to do it with their careers all the time. It's inevitable when you live in large communities. And if you stutter or you stumble or you mess up, once again, it's probably not going to get you killed. It's certainly not going to get you exiled from society and sent to live alone in the Sahara. So it just goes to show that those instincts, very useful in one setting, not so useful in another.
The evolution of agriculture and farming meant that we started adapting to the environment to suit us rather than the other way around. I mean, obviously there are positives and negatives to this. What would you say the key positives and negatives are?
Okay, positives to that sort of behavior. Well, when done right, it means we're no longer at the mercy of nature, which means we're no longer dependent on as vulnerable to, say, shifts in climate, ice ages, droughts, or having to stick to specific lush environments. We can move into arid deserts and irrigate. There's all manners a manner of things we can do to turn a potentially hostile environment, if you're just talking about walking through it and picking up food or hunting animals. Um, if you were to suddenly shape those environments with agriculture, you can feed a lot more people and survive in many more regions of the earth. Uh, the downside, of course, is when you get too good at it, and you set off a mass extinction event, or you may uh, eat well for a few generations because your form of agriculture is highly productive. But then when you exhaust the nutrients in the soil, as has happened in history, you might find that you either have to move regions completely or starve to death. So once you get to a certain amount of strength as a species, environment as an environmental force, that can backfire if you push things too far too fast, as happens with anything.
To jump forward to the development of written records and the advent of printing, how did that lead to the Renaissance and Reformation?
Okay, okay. Well, uh, so that's covering, goodness, that's covering about 4,000 years. All right. Well, uh, the the thing about written records is they originated in the earliest civilizations in Mesopotamia. First and foremost, because you had more people, you had more stuff clustering in agrarian societies and in cities. Ur in Mesopotamia had 50,000 people, and I don't think that number was exceeded for another 3,000 years. And in order to keep track of all that stuff, you had primitive writing, which is more or less just ledgers of livestock, trade goods. And then, of course, that evolved into communication and written histories and missives and communications, and even entertaining literature, works of philosophy. All very interesting, but most of the population is illiterate until the last 200 years. Most learning by humans is passed on by oral demonstration and physical demonstration. Physical, I mean, if you're a blacksmith's apprentice, he's not going to give you a book to read so much as he's going to ask you to watch him work. And then, really, because literature prior to the printing press is so expensive, I think even some of the richest places on earth only had a few hundred or maybe 2,000 books at most, 600 years ago. Because it's so expensive, it's not exactly practical for a wider segment of the population to become literate, even if everyone thought it was a good idea. But then the printing press changes all of that, and suddenly you've got this tremendous way of saving information and passing it on to future generations without constantly having to repeat it and reteach it every generation. It can slumber in an archive for 200 years. And suddenly that very useful idea that was very useful for us for thousands of years was then accessible to a wider segment of the public because you could print things much more cheaply and disseminate them much more quickly, which means ideas circulate faster and can be engaged with by a wider segment of the population, which means they can be tinkered with faster, which means that the whole pace of technological and ideological and philosophical um, progress and accumulation, it speeds up. And really, when you look at the total runtime of human history, you have a very rapid increase of literacy in the human population within just the space of a few centuries as a consequence of the printing press, to the point that everybody's literate today, and we have the world's a world of information at our fingertips via the internet.
So, leaping forward again, how did the Industrial Revolution benefit Britain in particular?
It benefited Britain in particular because it had a head start. So if you were to date the start of the Industrial Revolution in Britain at, let's say, 1750, okay? It'll be somewhere in there, but mid to late 18th century. By the beginning of the 19th century, although Britain was only a very small population compared to, say, something like China, it was already 3 times more productive as an economy, just as a result of that early bit of industrialization, which is very primitive by modern standards anyway, but 3 times more productive than any other economy in the world, which means per capita and for its size, it was the richest country on earth around the time of the Napoleonic Wars. And the thing is, no one else seemed to catch on that it was a good idea what Britain was doing until the 1830s. And that was Belgium, not by any means going to be a superpower anytime soon because of their small population. But yeah, it was the French and the Germans and the Americans. They only started to catch on about 1840s, 1850s, mid 19th century. So you have somewhere between 80 and 100 years a head start on the rest of the world, which is why Britain dominated in the 19th century. And it probably contributed to why it created one of the largest empires, the largest empire in human history, and why it was able to maintain splendid isolation for so long and maintain and fund a navy that completely set the balance of power in the world on its side. And you only start to see that crumble when the other nations of the world start to catch up and become equally as industrialized. But then the problem is when they're equally as industrialized, but they have a larger population, like the United States, that's going to shift the balance of power. And of course, Germany, again, the Germany as was in the early 20th century, a larger population, once it's fully industrialized, then you're dealing with a multilateral world, which is much more complex. And it's not surprising that the 2 world wars erupted when they did, as a result of that basic arithmetic.
So looking ahead to our near future, I mean, obviously there's lots more in the book about all the different millions of years that we've jumped through. But I wondered if you could list a few of the scenarios that might be possible in the near future, from technological breakthroughs that save us to complete environmental and societal collapse.
Well, yeah, this is the thing with trying to predict the future is it can easily become untethered because there's so many factors to deal with that you can go down a rabbit hole and lose sight of the sort of overall whole, the forecast you're trying to generally give. So when it comes to the future, uh, I found that all different scenarios fit into four umbrella scenarios. Um, the first one is, as you mentioned, sort of there's a technological breakthrough somewhere in the next 100, 200 years, which completely revolutionizes things and sets human history on another great acceleration of increasing complexity once again. Sort of a new innovation that is on par with the invention of agriculture or the advent of industry. And you can take your pick as to who the candidates are. Nowadays, particularly with the recent release of Chat GBT, people would point toward AI. Though, of course, that might be a tricky one to pick because there's a lot of people scared, uh, witless about potentiality of AI. But that's one thing. It could also be something like nuclear fusion, which suddenly allows us to have an unlimited amount of energy at a very low cost. So suddenly you can forget about your electricity bills. Um, it would be it would cost pennies if you had widespread economically viable nuclear fusion. And it would also allow the developing world to develop a lot more quickly, improve their standards of living without the concurrent degradation of the environment. So that would be another example of a potential great leap forward in scenario one, technological breakthrough. Number two is we don't see that breakthrough at any point in our lifetime, which is distinctly possible. We went uh, 12,000 years roughly, between the major advance of agriculture and the Industrial Revolution. So it's possible that it may be a very, very, very long time before something as momentous is developed again. However, the thing is, there's more people on Earth now, potential innovators, than there ever was before. We're more educated than we ever were before. And this sort of thing, collective learning, tends to accelerate. So odds are, it won't be 12,000 years, but it might be another century or two, maybe 400. But if that happens, in scenario number two, it's an equilibrium state where we don't have tremendous advances, but we don't have any sort of decline either. We just sort of live within our means and perhaps live sustainably, and not thoroughly degrade the environment, and perhaps that's the way forward for the 21st and 22nd century, warding off disaster. It's sort of I don't know. That scenario sort of encompasses a lot of futures that Al Gore and Greta Thunberg would be fans of. Green equilibrium scenario. So scenario one, complexity increases. Scenario two, complexity pretty much staying in equilibrium. Number three would be creative descent. That's to say, we start to strain all of our resources. There isn't a great uh, change in technology. Perhaps the world grows overpopulated. Projections are it shouldn't be a problem, but projections range between 10 and 13 billion people by the end of the century. Much of that depends on population growth in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, also the Middle East, also South Asia. And so if we were to strain that, or the population carrying capacity, or the environment, or something else, then we might actually have to see a deliberate unraveling of our complexity to avoid complete collapse. And that's scenario three, creative descent, where we're talking everything from rationing to tearing down factories and power plants, to draconian bans on automobile and air travel, and the eventual, over the course of several centuries, a devolution back to more agrarian living, than the industrialized, post-industrial, modern environments in which we live. But we don't collapse into a dystopian nightmare. Whereas scenario 4 is straight down collapse, and that's again an umbrella thing for any possible nightmare scenario that you would care to imagine: nuclear holocaust, environmental disaster, volcanic super eruption, a horrific disease that kills off 90% of the world population. I mean, the imagination is capable of imagining a lot of scary things. So I'll let everyone listening do the legwork on that. So really, regardless of the specifics of the future, it falls in one of those 4 categories. And so usually I would like to ask an audience, which do you think is the most likely and why? And that'll tell you a lot about your worldview and also what you deem important in terms of either problems or solutions for the future. So it's sort of a clarifying question to ask. So I do invite everyone to ask it of themselves.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I suppose it would depend how much of an optimist or a pessimist you are as well. Or perhaps if you work in particular fields, like if you're working in technology, you might feel that's the route out for us.
Certainly, there would be a lot of bias there too. Otherwise, I mean, if you thought technology wasn't going to save the day, you might question what you were doing with your career. But I'll ask you the question. Of those scenarios, the technological breakthrough, green equilibrium, creative descent, or collapse, which would you deem the most likely to occur in the next century to 2 centuries?
I would like to say technological development, because I don't think the planet is committed enough. The whole planet is committed enough to green approaches to resolve it in that way. I would love it to be that way. I don't think constant growth is our solution, but in view of the things that have changed in my lifetime, when I started work, there were no computers. Well, there were computers, but not in my workplace. We didn't have mobile phones till later. So even just in my working lifetime, things have changed so dramatically. I don't know what future changes might be, but I could imagine they could be fairly dramatic. But my fear is that we're past the tipping point. And I don't know, we'll just have to see what happens over the next few years. I may not be around to see it, but...
You're thinking either technological breakthrough or collapse, by the sound.
I guess so, yeah. Yes, and having lived through COVID as well, perhaps I watched too much science fiction as well.
Well, I mean, I will say this, a partial motivator for writing the book the way I did was there has been a definite uptick in pessimism in the last, I would say, 20, 25 years. And some of that has to do with geopolitics. Some of that has to do with sort of the splintering of political ideologies, the ramping up of extremism, the sort of growing awareness and extreme anxiety surrounding the environment. And then, of course, COVID on top of that. That all has generated an immense amount of pessimism, to the point that it's causing an epidemic of mental illnesses. We're not just talking about a zeitgeist that's here today and gone tomorrow. It's a very serious thing. But the thing is, when you look at history from the bird's eye perspective, there is quite a lot of foundation to be optimistic. Certainly, there's a lot of bad stuff that happened in the last several epochs of our history. But there has also been a trajectory where things in many ways have gotten better. And the further you look into the future, the more you realize that, yes, there's some challenges in the 21st century, but if we can get through them, things get very interesting. very interesting indeed. And so there will be a day when, our children or grandchildren or great grandchildren will be sort of embarking on a new frontier, provided we can get through the 21st century.
Well, let's hope that that is the future that we have in store for us. David Baker, thank you so much for joining us on this talk. And right way up, a brief history of the last 13.8 billion years is available now to buy. Please do buy through one of our recommended independent booksellers, Read Bookshop in Home Firth, or Fox Lane Books online. Support the independents. And if you're ever back in the UK, we'd love to host an event for you in person here in Yorkshire, if you'd like to come up.
Oh,
Right. And that would be really enjoyable.
Both my parents actually live in England.
Okay.
Not Yorkshire, but next time I visit, and I do visit often, I'll give you guys a shout.
Please do, please do. We'd love to invite you here. Thank you again. The 2023 Huddersfield Literature Festival runs from the 23rd of March to the 2nd of April. Please join us in person and online. You can find out more at our website, huddlitfest.org.uk.